We're just going to chat now. Thank you. No. I want to thank Ann Stanton for inviting me to take part in this tonight. I come here as not as a writer, not as an English lit major, but just as an enthusiastic reader. And I was introduced to Peter by a recommendation from a local bookseller, The Painter, when that came out. Loved it, went on and read Celine, loved it so much I read it twice. Started The Dog Stars about 75% of the way through that. And then I discovered this guy's not just a great novelist, he's an adventure writer, and there was so much history there, so I've delved into a lot of that. So tonight we'll try to touch on just about all of the books and everything that Peter's written and about his adventures, which is a tame word for what you have been through. So we'll start with Celine tonight. It's the newest book. It's out in softcover as of early January. And bestseller locally, bestseller around the country. And I just want to say prior to that, your other two books, The Dog Stars, first novel, critically acclaimed, great sales. The Painter, same thing. But they both involve male protagonists and violence. You've got Hig is a survivor of a flu epidemic, or a flu epidemic that kills 99% of the population, and the new world is it's kill or be killed. I mean, you have to survive, and Hig is a guy that learns how to kill when he has to protect his own life. In The Painter, you have a mild-mannered Western painter who winds up with two justifiable homicides, I would say, and he's on the run for his life. And then we come to Celine, and we have this 68-year-old woman who is raised in the north, well, raised in France till she's 7, and then raised in the East, and is well-educated and poised, but she's also a private eye and knows how to shoot a gun. So let's start with Celine. That seems like it came out of the blue. Where's the inspiration for that character?
Good question. So first I just want to say thank you to Molly. Wasn't it cool to start an evening like this with poetry? I'm such a talented young poet. I just love that. It's sort of like an invocation, and it sets the tone. And so thanks, Molly. And I want to say thanks to the whole team at the series. It's such a great honor to be here. I really love being up here in Michigan. Not just saying that. So Celine. So I start writing with a first line, and I never plot or outline because I wrote all this nonfiction. I mean, I had to make a living when I got out of college. They didn't tell me at the English department that you can't make a living writing poetry. They thought that was kind of mean of those guys. So I had to make a living. So I was a crazy kayaker, and I loved to write. So I started, writing for magazines. But all that nonfiction, I knew what was going to happen next because it happened, and I always knew the ending. When I finally got the chance to write the fiction I wanted to write novels, I didn't want to know. I wanted the same thrill that you get running a river in a kayak. If you run a river that's never been described, or you don't know, you come around a corner in a canyon, and there could be a waterfall or a cougar drinking, or 5 guys with bows and arrows, if you're on the right river. And I wanted that thrill with the narrative. I wanted to sort of put on the river of the story and just let it run and be as shocked and thrilled as the reader. So I started Celine with the first line, and I'm mostly interested in the music and the language because I came up as a poet. And the first line was something like, my mother's name was Amana Ambrosio in Tupi Warani. Amana means night rain. I liked the music of it. And pretty soon that was a young woman describing her childhood. And then this young woman describes losing her father over 20 years before to a supposed bear mauling in Yellowstone. But she doesn't think the evidence adds up. And so this young woman contacts this private eye. This private eye lives under the Brooklyn Bridge in this loft with this view of the bridge and the skyline. And she's an artist. And she makes stuff out of animal bones and skulls. And pretty soon I realized it's my mom. And I was writing my mom as she is. I wasn't changing a thing. I mean, my mom had this loft, and there were all these sculptures of bones and skulls. The window washer was so enamored of her work that the next day he brought her a human skull in a bucket. And he said, Mrs. Hella, don't ask. And so she covered it immediately in gold leaf, adorned it with some, and put it on a pedestal by the front door, and that's where it stands today. And so Mom died 3 years ago, and I was devastated. And I think that I think I sort of wrote the book. I mean, I think that the reason that Gabriella's story wound so quickly to the front door of my mother is that I wanted to spend another year with her, hanging out with her. And so writing the book was a way to really be intimate, you know, with my mother again, you know, and it was neat because I learned so much about her while I was writing it. You know, you have this sort of attention that's not like any other attention that you have in the rest of your life when you're writing, I find, this sort of zone. And putting that attention on my memories of my mother, I discovered all sorts of things that I didn't even knew that I know. Which is the interesting thing about fiction. You know, so often the fiction is, and the characters are smarter than I am, which is physically, you know, it defies natural laws.
Yeah. So Gabriella is as a girl, lost her mother Amana to the surf. They were out hunting for rocks, certain rocks, and she's left with her father, and the story goes on. She loses her father, who supposedly died to a bear mauled by a bear in Yellowstone. And you start with that, and you say, well, she'll have to call a private eye. And you start writing the private eye part, and you realize that's your mother. And so now the reader will wonder how much of the Celine character is your mother. For instance, in Celine, the novel, she's great with a gun. She knows how to handle a gun. All sorts of weaponry. Was that your mother?
All right, so my mom's sister was dying in Sun Valley, and she went to help her die. And I went to visit my mom to support her and to say goodbye to my aunt, who I loved. And she had just days to live. We were both very sad, and we were driving down through Haley, Idaho. And my mom said, Pete, pull over, will you? And it was a low concrete building, and it said Dick's Guns. I was like, all right. I pulled over. She gets out, opens the door, walks in, Armani scarf, click, 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 go the pumps. The guy at the end of the counter, and she's got, you know, gold scallop earrings, and guy at the end of the counter, he's cleaning a Walther on a cloth, and he's watching her like she's some strange species. Like, who is this woman? This little woman, she's petite. And she came up to the counter, and she leaned over, and her gold bangles clicked on the glass, and she said, could I see that one, please? And it was a 1911 Colt 45, this big, honking semi-automatic. And the guy said, it's a gift. And she said, no. No. And he said, well, you might want to start with the 22s over to your right. You know, they're a little easier to shoot. And only I knew that millimeter raise of the right eyebrow, this guy was on thin ice, man. He was like, she said, no, I'd really like to see that one. The guy came over, he took it out, he checked it, you know, he handed it to her. My mom picked it up, and I'm watching all this, I mean, and she made a stance at the wall. And then it was like I could see the cartoon bubble, you know, the thought bubble over the guy's head. He's like, ding, pretty good stance. She must watch a lot of cop shows. And then he was watching her, and he got so intrigued, he kind of looked at his watch, he was like, you know, we're going to close up in like 20 minutes anyway. Let's go shoot this thing. So we get in Dick Roop's Bronco, old rusted out Bronco, drive above Haley. There's a party spot, log, cans of bottles. He sets up 7 of them. He's very patronizing, showing her how to rack it. You know, don't shoot your pretty little toes off. She picked it up. She just went, bam, 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 bam. Every bottle and can just shattered, cans falling everywhere. The last shot, she looked at him and she took and she hit the can so that it jumped. And the guys, you could not have caricatured the guy's face. I mean, Norman Rockwell could not have done it justice. He just went. And me too. Yeah. I mean, her son, you know, I was like, she had these skills. And when she died, we opened up her little safe, and there were 7 handguns in there. There was that one and a couple of Glocks. There was one little 22 that you could put in a bra. And then there were all these certificates from, like, you know, combat shooting certificates. Who knew? So she had gathered these skills over her life that were extraordinary.
So that's a true story,
Yeah.
and that's the similar story in the book. So you drew heavily upon the detail.
Yeah, I just wrote her as she was, pretty much.
So in the book, there's a lot of loss. Gabriella loses her mother to the surf. She loses her father to a bear mauling, perhaps. And Celine loses her sisters in the book growing up. There's reference to that. And that just seems to be a theme that runs through there. She also, as a teenager, Celine, had a child in high school at her private school, and the child was taken from her immediately. Is that, where does that part of the story come from?
Okay, so all the family history in the book is true, and the backstories are true. But what I did was, in a couple of places, I conflated stories of her two sisters. She had a younger sister and an older sister, just like Celine. And it was Mom's older sister that went to the Putney School. And there's a dear friend here from the Putney School who works at the Putney School, came surprised me tonight. I'm so happy about it. Hi, Allison. It's really cool. So it was her older sister that went to the Putney School back in, this is she's born in 30, so it would have been 46, right after the war, who got pregnant. And the story is that my grandmother went up there. My grandmother was the partner with Admiral Bill Halsey, the commander of the 3rd and then the 5th Fleet, and one of the great fighting admirals of World War II. And they went up there together, and my grandmother went in her sable coat to the headmistress in Vermont and said, you told us it was a good idea to put 100 boys and 100 girls together on a farm.
Yeah.
And you're not kicking out my daughter. This is your problem. She got unexpelled.
Just like in the book.
Yep.
So in the book, Celine, that's kind of a subplot there, that Celine, Celine has a son in the book, so the son finally hears this story from a sister and says, somewhere out there I must have a sibling, a sister it turns out. So he's kind of looking, and that's her specialty, is finding missing family members. So was that something, as you wrote the book, did you try to give her some motivation? Why did she become a private detective, to find missing family members? Because she had lost her child, or how did that come about?
So I don't plan anything.
Yeah.
The thing about writers is writers make up stories, right? And writers really want to be smart, and that can be a problem. And the thing about it is that, people ask writers, well, how about this, this theme that runs through, this motifs and these metaphors, and this conceit and that, and this intention and that, and most writers just, my experience is most writers just sit down and follow their nose, and then they make up all this fancy stuff afterwards about what they meant to do. Yeah. And so when I was writing the book, I really wasn't thinking about it. I was just letting my mom be my mom, and letting her husband, I wrote as described. Pete Beveridge, I didn't even change his name. He was her Watson. He's a 7th generation Mainer, and Maine, reticence is like the state bird up there. So he didn't say much, and we called him the quiet American in the family. And I just wrote him as he was, and I just let them get on this case. The case is fictional, so that's really where the fiction is them following the clues, and then the sort of drama of the people that don't want this guy to be found, and the threats.
So there's, I asked you today about this, a lot of mysteries, and this is not your run-of-the-mill mystery. This just has so many layers, and the characters are so rich. And it's like people around the country are talking about these people as if they're real, which they kind of are, based on your mother here. But will there be a follow-up? Because a lot of mysteries are just character-based. You invent a character, and each book comes out once a year, and then they're into some new mystery or some new adventure. Celine is a little different, but the character's so interesting. It would be fun to have a follow-up. Is there a follow-up on deck?
I don't know. I don't want to get killed because I had a woman corner me in Vermont, grab my collar, and she actually pushed me against the wall and said, "There's got to be a sequel. We've got to know." And I should just say, yeah, there probably would be a follow-up. I honestly don't know, because I write. I sit down and I go with the music of the language, and and a voice. And I suppose if Celine's voice started to talk, I would surely go there, because then I would get to hang out with Mom again.
So that's a maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly. References in the book.
It's like asking people if they're going to run for president.
Exactly. Never say never. There's a reference to Bruce Willis in the book. I
That's
think
a
it's
true story.
at an airport or something.
Yeah,
Is there
true.
any particular reason that you chose Willis for the?
No, it's a true story. My mom was she was rolling her, she was probably 70 at the time. She's rolling her bag through the airport, her little bag, and a hand came and grabbed the handle. Said, "Allow me, ma'am." And she looked up, and it was Bruce Willis. And they got to the counter, and then Mom had to declare her Glock. Her Glock 19. And she took it out of she had to check the bag. She took it out and put it up. And Bruce Willis just like, he looked at this little petite woman with all the gold, and he got that smile. Not the one before he kills you, but the one that, they got to talking, and she said she was a PI, and he gave her his card and said, if you and your husband are ever in LA, look me up. And maybe he wanted to make a movie out of her. Right, yeah. I don't know.
Well, could be a connection there in the future. Because has that been optioned for a film?
Yeah. ABC wants to maybe make a TV series, so we'll see.
There you go. I want to go back. Let's see. For Celine, we might circle back if we have time and do a reading. So if you've not read Celine, Peter can give you a sample here coming up. Hemingway, in all of your books that I've read, it seems there's direct or indirect references to Hemingway, especially Nick Adams, which are the stories set in northern Michigan. What's up with that? I mean, why is every time I open a Peter Heller book, in The Painter, they called the painter Hemingway was his nickname. Mm-hmm. I think it came up in Celine. I forget the context, but what's with Hemingway and you?
So when I was 11, my dad read to me every night before I went to sleep. He always read to me, and he read a lot of poetry, and he read, E. Cummings to me when I was like 6, which is sort of grounds for social services, if you think about it. A lot of those poems are sort of bawdy, and it was good that I didn't understand them. But I love the music of the language, and he read Treasure Island to me and stuff like that. And he read Hemingway to me later. But when I was 11, I was wandering around my little school library in New York City, and I had a crush on the librarian. Her name was Annie Bosworth, and she was English. And I would have married her right then for the way she said my name. She said, "Pita, are you looking for something to read?" And I was like, and a great librarian, like a great bookseller, has followed your reading since you were little, and knew what you're ready for. And she went over to the fiction shelf, and she pulled down In Our Time, that little book of stories, mostly Nick Adams stories about Upper Michigan. And I took it home, and you have to sort of imagine a little boy in New York City cracking that open. I wanted to do that. I wanted to hop off a slow train up in the woods in Upper Michigan and carry a rucksack through grass that wet my pant legs with dew, and make camp by the Big Two-Hearted River, and make cowboy coffee. I didn't know what that was, but it sounded awesome. And I wanted to not burn my tongue the way Nick didn't burn his tongue, and I wanted especially to fish for those beautiful trout. In the end of something, that gorgeous breakup story, that little story, I wanted to have a girlfriend that could row and fish like a man and then break up with her. because Nick did, and I don't know why he did. I still wonder why she was so awesome. Why did he do that? I came to the conclusion that it's because she was way too good for him, which is usually the case with men and women. But mostly I wanted to write about it all like this guy, because the prose, I had that experience of prose that I love coming straight into my heart, like through my skin. I mean, when you read writing that you just adore, it seems to sort of bypass the head almost and go straight here. And I wanted to do that. And so he was, I owe a lot to this writer and to this country that he wrote about so beautifully.
And to that librarian, I was going to say, if it wasn't for that librarian that you had a crush on, would we be sitting here today?
Well, my dad, he was very literary and had stacks of books. He was so probably, but that was a very seminal experience, and I do owe her a lot.
Any thoughts on the importance of parents reading to children? Because right now, I think across the country, but even locally here, there are several efforts to get parents to read to newborns and all the way up through preschool and into elementary school.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many of you all had that experience, but to me, it was one of my very favorite things when I was little. Was to, I look forward to going to bed because my dad would read to me, and I just loved it, and I think it's very important. I think once little kids I think it's like listening to good music when you're little. You get used to the cadences and the beauty of the language, and you just and the pull of the story and the fascination of a wonderfully drawn character. And I think that you just want more and more of it, which can't be bad.
Yeah. So in becoming a writer, and we'll touch on your adventures. I mean, you became a world-class kayaker. You learned to surf. You learned to fly. You've been on the eco-pirate ships battling the whale, the illegal whalers, all kinds of crazy things, mostly on the water. Did you become an adventurer who said, well, I like to write, so I might as well write about my adventures? Or did you become a writer who said, I'm a writer, I might as well write about my adventures? What role, how did it all unfold?
It was all together. When I was little, I thought, I only have one life, but I want to do like 12 things.
Yeah.
And so it was sort of like that. I knew that I always wanted to be a writer, but I always thought that you could do all this other stuff and it would just feed the writing. You would meet people and hear stories, and that's sort of why I did all those jobs, partly because I loved it. I loved being outside. I loved doing physical work. And writing is solitary. And, you're sitting in the coffee shop and you're basically alone, working half the day. And I love being on a crew. I love being on a framing crew or being on a little lobster boat with 2 or 3 other guys. And so all those jobs were really fun for me, and at the same time I was keeping journals and I was listening to people's stories, and so the adventure, when I started to kayak, I took to kayaking like an otter. I just love rough water, and I love being upside down. I don't even mind that. I like getting tumbled and having forces bigger than me, kind of throw me around. I think it's fun. And so a friend of mine said, we were skiing once, and I was in my 20s, and he was a ski instructor up at Breckenridge. He always had a free pass for me. I was always broke, and so I go up and ski on Mondays. And I remember driving back from the mountain. He said, why don't you combine your interests? Why don't you just, you're kayaking all this crazy stuff, and you're spending half your day in your room writing poetry. Why don't you write for Outside Magazine? And so when you're young and dumb, you don't know what you can't do. And I went down to the magazine store and I picked up an Outside Magazine, and I looked on the masthead, where they show all the editors, and I picked a name that sounded nice. She was a senior editor, Laura Honhold. Doesn't that sound? Yeah. She sounds nice. So I got the 800 number for Outside. I called up and I said, Laura Honhold, please. And the receptionist said, just a minute. And I was like, and she said, Laura here, and I started talking really fast. And I said, hey, I live in Colorado. I'm a writer. I just had a story published in Harper's, which is sort of true. And it was just a little reprint of a college story in the reading section. It was small, but it was in there. And I said, I kayak class 5, and I think you should send me to this expedition to do this first descent of this river on the Tibetan Plateau. And there was this, just like this. And then she said, I'm going to take a chance on you. We've heard about this expedition. We'd like to cover it, but we don't have a writer that can kayak class 5, and I'm going to pay half your expenses, and if you write a good story, I'll pay the other half and buy the story. So I was so excited. I needed a new paddle anyway. Mine was all duct taped together, And so I went, and it was a couple of rafts of professional river runners.
Where was this again?
So it was western Sichuan, almost into Tibet, right beneath the Himalayas.
Okay.
a beautiful, beautiful country full of Buddhist temples and, just be gorgeous. And snow, the Himalayas right there. And so we decided to do a practice run. There were 3 of us in kayaks. Kayaks are sort of you go out ahead and you run safety and stuff. And 2 paddle rafts. And there was one couple that was on their honeymoon, and everyone was professional river runners, and these guys weren't, but they were very athletic, strong, and they loved canoeing, and they figured if they put one on each raft, they'd be fine, because they were paddle rafts. So as we were putting in for the practice run, sort of a gear shakedown and a crew shakedown, you could see a dark storm over the mountains, and the river was rising. And by the time we put on, it was really raucous. And I remember I was just surfing a wave and just warming up, and I peeled off, and I came around the corner, and I saw one of the rafts doing cartwheels beneath the ledge with nobody in it. And I sprinted ahead as fast as I could, and I saw a helmet in the waves. And I paddled as hard as I could up to the helmet, and I gave him my stern. He tried to grab it. We got separated by a crashing wave, and we were starting getting shoved into a bank, and I could see a log jam. And I hit the shore, and I could see him his helmet went into the log jam, which is like a sieve. And there was already another helmet there stuck. And I ran out on the logs, and I grabbed the guy who had been in the river, and I started pulling, and the other kayaker was right there, this other guy, Scott, and we grabbed him, we pulled him off onto the shore. He was still alive, and he was one of the Chinese guys. And we ran back for the guy who had already been there, and we pulled, and he was stuck. And we put a Z-drag on him, which is a pulley system, and we couldn't budge him. And the river was rising, and we held his head up, and we held his head out of the water, and then the river rose, and he died.
He died
in our arms, and we had to paddle back across the river and tell his wife that her husband had just died, and they were on their honeymoon. So the next day, we gathered by the river. The water had dropped, and it was just such a pretty river again, class 4. And we sang Amazing Grace, and I had a book of Chinese poems. I thought for my first magazine assignment I would bring a book of poems from the place to get the heart of the place. And it was a book of Tang Dynasty poems from like the 9th century. And I read one, and then we went up for 2 weeks. The Chinese revoked our permit. We went up on the Tibetan plateau in these grasslands where people were herding yak, like with dragging travois behind their horses and living in yurts, sort of like the Great Plains in 1870. And no Westerner had been up there since 1959. It was surreal, and we were all grief-stricken. And I came home, and I called Laura Honhold, and I said, I can't write your story, I'm sorry. And she said, what happened? I sort of unloaded for like 45 minutes. So you could have heard a pin drop. I mean, she didn't say a word. And then she said, you go write that. And that was their submission for the National Magazine Award that year.
Wow.
And it was an odd way to start in journalism. And I knew that if I didn't get another assignment right away and paddle something hard, that I might not kayak again. So I got invited. I got invited on this Kiwi Russian expedition to Tajikistan. And to run this thing, it was the very end of the Soviet Union, 1989. It was to run the Everest of rivers in the Soviet Union. It was supposed to be the hardest river. And the last team that had tried it had lost 5 of their 11 guys. And I was going to be one of the kayakers. There was a Kiwi and me, and it was a big expedition. We were the guys who were going to go out front and sort of, check the line out and tell people to get out and stuff. And it was mythic. I mean, we landed up in these mountains in the high Pamirs above Afghanistan, and there was a dead snow leopard right by the camp. And there were, the river came out of a hole in the ground beneath a glacier, this big river, just a big boil, and there were wolf tracks in the sand, on and on. And the Russians and Kiwis, this was like a perfect antidote to the last trip, because the Russians and Kiwis were like oil and water. You'd get to a really tough rapid, you'd wave everybody over, and they'd get out, and the Russians would squat and start chain smoking. And they'd look all grim, and it was like the weight of history. It was like Tolstoy. And the Kiwis, they'd be hopping around the bank going, oh, she'll be right. Oh, I see a line, no worries, And the guy that had to navigate between the teams was the translator, Vanya, and he learned all his English from Frank Zappa records. And so he could sing all those songs. And one night he pulled me aside and he said, Pete, I'm guiding geology expedition in the same area here last year. And We are camped, and next drainage over is camped international team of scientists led by French guy looking for Yeti. So one night, Pete, I take Swiss Army saw, and I've got the plywood deck from Raft, and I cut foot. And I put handle on foot, and Rock Creek here, and moraine, and snowbank, and I make tracks. He said, Pete, next day they discovered the tracks. Made international headlines, and you can look it up. And he said, but only one problem, Pete, was all left feet. So clearly the scientific rigor, not peer reviewable. But anyway, it was a perfect antidote, and that launched this sort of career of adventure writing, which became environmental.
So your first assignment, guy dies in your arms. The second assignment, you take on the Everest of rivers, where 5 people died trying it before. You were successful. Are there maps? Are there notes from previous expeditions? I mean, how do you know when you're, like when you play a golf course, you have notes on what the next hole is like, or do you just go blind?
Well, they had us, the kayakers. They were blind. But they knew, the guys knew that there was, after we put on, they knew that within, 20 miles there was going to be this really deep canyon, and it was going to be bad. But we didn't know, we didn't have descriptions of the rapids.
I've seen footage, video of some of these waters that you guys paddle, and it makes Tequamanon Falls in the UP look like a faucet dripping.
I don't know.
They go over and straight down into the water, and was there... You obviously weren't afraid. You accepted these missions because people died, and it's very easy to die out there. You can flip and not be able to flip back up, or you crash into a boulder.
Yeah, I got scared. I would get scared, yeah. Sure. But, there were times, especially on that trip, you'd stretch your kayak in the morning, you'd stretch your spray skirt over the kayak in the morning, over the cockpit, yeah. And I would wonder, is this the last time I'm going to do this?
Did you say something about it being almost a divine feeling to finish and get through the rapids at some point?
Well, in a big rapid, once you make, it's a real, the thing about paddling, and it's probably the same with climbing, and it's like everything we do, it's sort of like it's a metaphor for your life. And what I found was that I would look at a rapid and I would feel scared, and the big rapid, and then once I committed to doing it, and started really focusing on where the line was. Once I'd made the commitment, okay, I'm doing it, it felt like, all the energy goes forward. And then, once you put on a violent rapid, it's kind of crazy, but everything goes quiet. Oh. It's almost silent. And you're just responding. You've already, you've envisioned every stroke through the thing, where you're gonna, paddle on the edge of a hole, and how you're gonna, get around it, and then it's just like this flow, and it's all quiet, and it's really beautiful.
So after that, one of your missions, you actually didn't paddle. You were you were assigned to follow this expedition down the Zangpo River, this gorge between the in Tibet, in the Himalayas, and that one resulted in a book, not Heller, but Hell or High Water.
Right.
Hell or High Water. What was the significance of that mission? If the previous one you did was a river that nobody conquered before until you and your crew did, what was the significance of this Zangpo mission? I
think they wanted to do the deepest gorge in the world, and it was a gorge that was sacred to Buddhists. This gorge is like incredibly magical. It's you got to imagine a gorge in the Himalayas that is so deep that it's subtropical on the bottom, and there were 4 species of leopard, there were tigers. Mm. There were these cloven-hoofed animals called takin that are endemic, only exist there. And you're in, there's 200 species of rhododendron and bananas that have never been described. There's so many of them. And straight over your head when you're on the riverbank are 25,000-foot peaks blowing snow. It's that deep. This is like 5 miles straight down. And it's, only one team had been through there. It was a National Geographic team that documented the place in 1998. And we were in 2002. Nobody had ever kayaked it. And these guys chose to do it in the middle of the Himalayan winter because that's when the water would be low. You know, so many of the tributaries would be locked in ice and the water level would be low enough. It was still huge water. And so it was wild. In the river, of course, it was so crazy. But on the ground, people almost died almost every day. It was just, we had to climb up around these spurs, and we were in the bamboo forest in the snow, and there were tiger tracks. Porters were deserting. We started out with 60 porters, and they just kept...
porters carry all of the gear?
They carried a lot of the food, and and they would just deserting because it was so rugged. And then you get deep in there, you go over this pass and down into the river again, and there's like a cave. And in the cave are little butter candles and prayer flags. And you're like, holy cow. This is like one of those Chinese, those old pen and ink or brush and ink landscape paintings, of the mountains in China, back in the Tang Dynasty. And, that's what it felt like. And there are leopard tracks on the beach. It was like the most mythic thing. It was crazy.
So you were, how remote were you? There was
nobody for, 1,000 miles. It was like really something. Yeah.
I think when I read some of those adventures, I think of Everest, and I've read a bit about Everest. John Krakauer was a climber journalist, and he went on a mission in '96, I think it was, and 8 or 9 people died trying to summit. Yeah. And one guy in Goodhart, Michigan, which is a Hemingway country up the road here, he was on that mission and survived, and he wrote a book, and he said the fact that a journalist was along, nobody knew about until he joined them, and he felt there was pressure on the guides to summit, because they didn't want to come out with an article that said, we almost made it, or other people have made it, but we didn't. So he felt there was pressure, and that might have caused some of the deaths. Was there any dynamic like that with you as you were on the crew chronicling this mission?
Nah, these guys were consummate pros, and they knew what they could paddle and what they couldn't, and that's why nobody died.
Where did they find these guys?
Where do you find anybody crazy? Yeah. I don't know. They're everywhere.
That's one right here. All right, another kayak adventure. This one did not result in a book, but it did result in a documentary that won an Academy Award, I believe, The Cove, and that was on kayak.
No, that was on a surfboard.
On a surfboard. Can you tell us about that project?
So I got an assignment to, I went to the Telluride Mountain Film Festival, and the guy that had helped me with the Tibet book, he was an old, what did he do? He analyzed U-2 film. Remember the U-2s that flew over Russia? This guy had the highest security clearance in the government, and he was one of the analysts who took those, and a very interesting guy. But he loved looking at the Earth from the sky, and one thing that captivated him was the Sangpo Gorge, because it was such a feature, and so he had studied it for years and the history of it. So he had helped me when I was writing that book about the history of the place, so I met him there, and he said, "Oh, have you met this guy, Captain Paul Watson of Sea Shepherd? He's over there at that table. I think you should meet him. He's radical." Yeah. So I went over and I introduced myself, and this guy had this, white mane and a beard and this kind of safari jacket. And he shook my hand, and the first thing he said to me was, "I've sunk half the Norwegian whaling fleet and half the Spanish." I'm like, no one had ever said that to me before. And I heard him speak to 2,000 people in this auditorium. You could have heard a pin drop. And when he was done talking about the whale that he tried to save in a Zodiac from a Russian harpooner, and the whale that got harpooned, this big gray whale, and how in its last dying throes, bubbling blood, how it reared up and used every ounce of muscle to stay away from crushing the Zodiac because it knew that they were trying to protect. He told that story, and watching the whale's eye go beneath the surface and the connection. I still get, people were crying all through that auditorium. And at the end of it, he said, "Would you come with," he knew I was a journalist, he said, "Would you come with me on my next campaign to Antarctica to, harass the Japanese whaling fleet and attack them?" I was like, yeah, of course. I mean, what else would I say? And I got, National Geographic was very loath to, send a journalist because A, they didn't want to glorify eco-terrorism, if that's what these guys were, and B, they didn't want their journalists to go native. So they made us sign a letter, both Watson and myself, that said that I was a non-participant, I was a journalist. And I had that letter laminated, so it was waterproof, so that I could put it in my dry suit so that if we got sunk and the Japanese picked us up, I could wave the letter and say, don't put me in jail and feed me whale meat. It's like, I'm a journalist and you need to send me home. And I actually had that letter. So I got the assignment, I was excited about it. I had my little duffel bag, I landed in Australia, I went down on the docks in Melbourne. You got to picture a prosperous dock with cafes and restaurants, and tied up is this all black pirate ship flying a Jolly Roger. And I walked up to the superstructure, which is the part that sticks up with a bridge on it, and there were all these skulls and crossbones with the names of ships, Isba 1, Isba 2, the Marild. They were all ships these guys had sunk or rammed on the high seas. And I was like, wow. And then they told me it was a vegan ship, and that I sort of hid my fishing gear. And then the guy who showed me my berth was this Hell's Angel tattoo artist, and he said, you have to sleep in your clothes. And I was like, why? He said, in case we get sabotaged by, like the way the Rainbow Warrior did, Greenpeace, in case we get blown up, that could save your life, the time it takes, getting out. So then it dawned on me that this might not be such a lark. We sailed south, we picked up a helicopter, 2 days south of Tasmania. All the welders came on deck and welded a big blade to the port bow. Triple reinforced steel, T-steel, and it was sharp, and it was for gutting the hulls of ships. And that's when I knew that this was no lark at all, that these guys were totally committed and were willing to die to save a whale. And it was very, actually, sort of moving that all these people were willing to sort of stand up for another species. Where does that happen? And as I learned more, there were documentary filmmakers on the ship, there were biologists, there were people involved in all sorts of environmental fields, and I began to learn more about the crisis of the oceans. And it was not too long into the trip that I sort of did go native, and I really believed that what they were doing was very important. And for all the sensational stuff about the Jolly Roger and the can opener, all that, they had never hurt anybody. What they were really doing was being sensational so they could attract people like me to write stories so that they could publicize the crisis of the oceans. Because Paul Watson told me, he said, look, if we can't save a whale in a whale sanctuary, during a moratorium on commercial whaling, if we can't save a whale, what chance does a sea cucumber have? What chance does a non-charismatic crab have, or a seagull? And it made a lot of sense.
So that was the book that resulted in Whale Wars? What was
Whale Warriors. And then,
Whale Warriors.
And then Animal Planet made the TV show.
The Animal Planet made a TV show out. But
so anyway, getting to the Cove. So the guys who were making the Cove movie about the dolphin slaughter in Taiji, Japan, it's this inlet where they herd the dolphins in, and they slaughter them. And they call the prime females for dolphinariums. They read the book, and they called me up and said, "Hey, we really loved Whale Warriors. We thought it was really cool. Would you come with us and be the first journalist to come in with us when we sneak into the Cove and plant the cameras to film this thing?" This cove was it was razor wire surrounding it. They had armed patrols because they did not want anybody documenting this thing, because they knew that if the public saw this, there would be international outcry. There already was, but to have graphic footage was something that the Japanese really did not want. And so I went in with, they said, you bring the camo, we'll supply the face paint. And we snuck in at night into the Cove. We planted cameras that looked like rocks. It was made by Lucas Films Lab. They made them look just like rocks. We had cameras that looked like birds' nests. We planted them at night. We went up on the cliff and in camo and started filming. And then when they started killing, 5 of us paddled in on surfboards. And they drive the pod in, they net it off, and they start spiking and
You had a helmet cam, didn't you? For
Yeah,
that?
they put a helmet cam on me, and when we paddled out, the inlet was already paint red with blood, and it was a pod of about 50 little pilot whales, which are like big dolphins, and it was like 12 left, and they were huddled against the net. There were like 3 nets strung across. And they were terrorized, and we paddled out, they huddled away from us against, they were traumatized, and we formed a circle, and we began to pray, and it was a surfer's circle in prayer, and it's what you do when a surfer buddy dies, and you make a surfer's circle and you pray, and we were praying for these pilot whales, and they started to relax. I mean, they started to see that we weren't a threat, and they started just to flow along the net and then around, and then a little baby spy hopped and looked at us, and I knew that within an hour they would all be killed, and I just started to cry, and all of us just started to cry, and that was in the movie. We filmed, and then the fishermen came in and attacked us with these poles, and that's in the movie. When you see the fishermen attacking the surfers, that was filmed on my little head cam. And I got home from that assignment, and I lay in bed beside my wife every night, and she would fall asleep, and I would just weep. I mean, it was the worst thing I've ever seen. I mean, these animals were self-aware. They could hear that, they're part of their clan, their family being killed. They knew what was going on. And what it profoundly, the message to me from those last 12 that were up against the nets when we were there, what I got from them is that it's really important to speak for the ones that can't speak for themselves. I mean, that's our responsibility. I mean, we are screwing things up 1,000,000 miles an hour. We're in the middle of the 6th great mass extinction. It's caused by us, and some of us need to start speaking for the ones that can't.
Did that movie... The movie, the documentary that won the Academy Award in that instance, and then the whale slaughter that you documented in your book, did either of those bring awareness to the situation and improve it at all to eliminate that kind of killing? Or has it had any kind of positive?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, when the movie came out, The Cove, they nominally stopped killing dolphins, but they killed every other small cetacean. So it was a PR move. They still kept killing false killer whales and pilot whales and all that. But it did raise awareness, and there's a lot more people concerned about it now, and the Japanese government's getting pressure. The same with the Antarctica thing. Australia with I think that the things like the book and the TV show, the publicity around it helped the political will, the momentum for the Australian government to bring a case against the Japanese in the International Court in The Hague, and the Japanese lost, and they were told to stop, and they did for 2 seasons, and then they decided, heck with that. What are you going to do? We're going again, and now they're whaling again.
And the Japanese, I talked to you earlier about this, because I just think, well, if they're killing these whales in a whale sanctuary, and there's no Coast Guard or any kind of law enforcement around other than these eco ships that you were on, why did they do that? What did they use the whales for?
That's a good question, because they have surplus. There's like 5 tons in freezers. They get subsidized to the tune of $70 million a year by the Japanese government. There's no economic reason for it. And I think a lot of it is about face. It's about, MacArthur told the Japanese, when they didn't have much to eat after World War II, he said, why don't you whale? You're an incredible maritime people, seagoing people. The Norwegians came over, taught them how to commercially whale, and the Japanese became really good at it because they're incredible seamen. And to all of a sudden, have the U.S. basically to tell them to stop, they don't like that. And there's got to be other reasons too. I think the Yakuza, the mafia is involved in it, and they somehow get part of the government subsidy and stuff. It's just a sin.
So you've had great adventures, but some really low points. I mean, thankfully document that, but to have to witness that in your adventure writing days, and for the last few years you've been turning out fiction. Is there a difference? What is the big difference between writing nonfiction and fiction?
So I've always, I wanted to write fiction ever since I picked up that, in our time, and I did. I wrote short stories for all those years, but I had to make a living. I started writing for magazines, and I got joyfully diverted. I mean, what could be more fun for someone who loves to kayak, to go around the world and do this wild stuff? It became clear to me that the ecosphere was unraveling after a few years of doing those stories. I wrote more and more environmental stories. How cool is that? It's very fulfilling. But when I had 9 months out a few years ago, and I thought, I don't think I have to take a magazine story for 9 months. It's time. I want to write the novel I've always wanted to write. And it was like coming home. That's what it felt like. It was just taking that other hand from behind the back, just having free run of the imagination. And as I said, I just start with the first line. And I'll tell you the cool thing about fiction. I sat down, I started with that first line that Doug read so wonderfully. And then right after the part where he read, he said, my name is Hig, one name, Big Hig, if you need another. If I ever woke up crying in the middle of a dream, and I'm not saying I did, it's because the trout are gone, every one. And as soon as I heard that, I was in there, I was listening, and I sat up and I thought, okay, tell me. And it was as if this guy, Hig, was across the camp. I'd go to the coffee shop, and it was as if he was across the campfire from me on an October night with the wind blowing the flames around. And he was telling me what happened to him a few years before, and it was so thrilling. Of all these adventures, it was the most thrilling thing I'd ever experienced. And I would come to work, and I would just sit down. I'd say, don't think, just listen. And I would listen. And I wrote the book, and I'd laugh out loud. I'd burst into tears. I'd have like tears dripping on to the coffee table. And I know that people in the coffee shop were going, "That poor son of a bitch." He's like going through a bad divorce or whatever. But what was really happening was I was having the most thrilling experience of my life. And when I got to the last page of the Dog Stars, Hig is lying out under the stars, and he says, my favorite poem is written by Li Shangyin in the 9th century in the Tang Dynasty. When will I be home? It's the poem that I read for Dave 25 years before on the side of the river. I didn't even know that I knew it. It goes, when will I be home? When will I be home? In the mountains, in the rainy night, the autumn lake is flooded. One day we will be back together again. We will sit in the candlelight by the west window, and I will tell you how I remembered you tonight on the stormy mountain. That's the magic of fiction, It just.
We're getting close to Q&A, and I have a lot of questions about your fiction. And I wanted to do, if you could do a reading in a moment from Celine and share some of that, would that be all right?
I don't know. Do you guys want to use the time up to hear reading, or do you want to just ask questions? So I think we'll leave it up to those guys.
Well, I wanted to ask about loss, because as you say, you make it up as you go, which is amazing, but there are some themes or similar, like rivers are in all of your books and Hemingway's in all of your fiction. But everybody loses something. They lose loved ones, they lose the life they knew, and is that on purpose, or where does that come from?
I think I've thought about it because people have asked about it, and I think that we go to writers that we love because I think that writers draw from almost like mountain springs, like certain well springs that are up on the mountain. And some writers, we love them because their spring water, it tastes sweet, or it's sort of dusty, or some of the springs have a metallic taste or a mossy taste, or some are cold and some aren't. But we love the taste of their water. And And I think my spring just has to do with a lot of loss, and I'm not sure why. You know, I'm not a depressed person, but I feel like maybe that's our job. You know, I mean, we get born, and then pretty soon we just start to lose stuff. You know, one after another, and it's kind of our job to make meaning and to make connection and to love, despite, you know, and because of, you know, the losses that we face every day and every week and every year, and I think it makes us very special.
Well, how about if we do a reading, if you wouldn't mind?
Okay.
I think that people, many people have probably read you, maybe some here haven't, so it would be great to hear from you.
Okay, I'll
your
read.
words.
I'll read.
And
Yeah.
this is Celine is the 68-year-old private eye with her husband. They've been hired by Gabriella to see if her dad indeed had been mauled at Yellowstone by a bear and was dead. And they're driving across Wyoming now in a camper, her son's camper, headed to Montana?
Yep, heading to Montana, and so here they are driving north. Celine didn't really relax until they turned up into the Sweetwater Valley, and the ranges on either side got close, and their flanks were dark with timber, and the meadows were green. So were the irrigated fields of the ranches lying along the river, the neat white ranch houses peeking out from groves of boisterous cottonwoods. She opened her window and let the late afternoon wind pour in, and it smelled of alfalfa and wet fields and the river. They drove into Lander just as the sun was settling into the long escarpment of the Wind Rivers. Just 3 more latitudes north made a difference here at the end of September. The air pouring through the window was chilly with fall, and she could smell wood smoke. The aspen were already turning on the higher ridges, slashing the shoulders of the mountains with ochre and gold. Glorious this time of year. It was good to be out of the city now, good to be rolling, traveling, letting her losses toss in her wake. The cold currents would bring them around again, surely, probably tonight as she slept. And if she woke up to the strange silences of a new town and lay in the dark listening, she would welcome them home and taste without bitterness the oddly sweet grief of missing those one loves. But now it was wonderful to forget for a few hours, to be traveling, to hear tires hum and thwop on cracks in the pavement, to come to a T in the road above a creek whose meadow was dotted with horses, roans, and Appaloosas, and smell smoke from the wood of trees that didn't even grow in the east. Celine didn't feel like cooking. Pa offered, but she waved him off. Let's have ribs, she said. Isn't that what they eat in Wyoming? And then let's go find a pullout somewhere to make our new home. I feel a little like a hermit crab. Carrying his house on his back? We had one as a pet, you know. Mimi brought it home from Simmons Point one day in her glasses case. Mummy had a fit. You were all suckers for a stray. He was not at all a stray. I'm sure she plucked him from a very fine family where he'd been quite happy. It made me mad, kind of a lesson for me in not offering help where it isn't needed. Did you make her put him back? No, she was irrationally attached. At the end of the summer, I abducted him and put him right back in the little tidal pool where she'd found him. I'd been with her that day. Anyway, over the summer, he'd been quite spoiled. She dropped all manner of food into the pickle jar. One Friday night, she brought him to the movies. She swore to me that he crawled to the edge of the jar, came half out of his shell, and watched. Ginger Rogers. She swore on the Bible that he moved all his little legs like he wanted to dance. She said he was an almond and wasn't allowed to dance. I finally figured out she meant Amish. I had learned about them from our nanny, and I'd been telling her about how they don't have zippers, which she thought was hysterical. She changed Benny's salt water twice a day. When it was clear that he was actually growing, she found several empty snail shells and dropped them in. He inspected them and found them lacking. I told her that probably they couldn't have holes. She thought he'd like to have windows in his new house. Finally, she found a beautiful, glossy, symmetrical shell, all covered in irregular black spots like a paint pony and with no pinholes. Benny took one look and moved right in. Years and years later, as an adult, she told me she thought of that as one of her proudest moments. Isn't that odd? So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Oh, and then Pete half smiled. It was his way of giving vigorous applause. So they drive through town. They pass a loaf and jug in the Safeway and a gas station turned burger joint and 2 stores featuring Native American crafts. It was that time of day or night that happens only a few weeks a year at certain hour in certain parts of the American West. The sun sets behind mountains, but the cloudless sky that is more than cloudless, it is lens clear, clear as the clearest water, holds the light entirely, holds it in a bowl of pale blue as if reluctant to let it go. The light refines the edges of the ridges to something honed, and the muted colors of the pines on the slopes, the sage Ruffin fields, the houses in the valley, the colors pulse with the pleasure of release, as if they know that within the hour, they too will rest. Maybe Celine thought this way because she was exhausted. She was. It had been a long time since she'd driven that far in a day. Main Street curved to the right, and they passed the double-op motel, which made them laugh as there were probably patrons doing things there that doubly ought not to do. And Celine abruptly threw the wheel over and executed a U-turn that startled Pa and squealed the tires. Practice, she smiled, 27 miles per hour, pretty good, didn't even think about rolling. Never know when we might need one of those. I was thinking we ought to head back to the Lander Grill. They might not have ribs, but I bet they serve a mean steak.
Oh. Well, shall we go for the Q&A section?
Sure.
All right. I believe we have mobile microphones out there, so any questions for Peter Heller? Feel free to raise your hand upstairs or down. We have one against the wall over there.
I got to take a picture of you guys because I was once at a biker funeral. Sons of Silence. My friend who was a cop, we were drinking coffee, and he said, you got to go down to the church, the Baptist church down by the highway. There were 2,000 black motorcycles in the parking lot, and it was for the guy who had founded the Sons of Silence, which is a pretty vicious gang, you know, like the Hells Angels. And there was a truce among all the gangs that were all there, the Hells Angels, the Banditos. Anyway, they were all in this church, and the chaplain got up with the gang, and he said, J.R.'s son wanted me to take a picture of the crowd here today. He said, I know a lot of you have warrants, so I'll do it on the count of 3. And he said 1, 2, 3, and I swear to God, everyone around me went like this. So I'm going to give you guys the same opportunity to, yeah. Anyway.
So over there on the left wall.
Yeah.
Our left.
You've obviously led an extraordinary life, you might say. Do you think you would have been capable of writing what you're writing today without all those experiences, the heartache, the joy, the excitement, the adrenaline, et cetera, et cetera?
I think it would have been different. I think it was Flannery O'Connor who said that anybody who survives adolescence has enough to write about for the rest of their lives. And I sort of feel like that way. I mean, think of her work and Eudora Welty, these people that stayed home all their lives, but their beauty of their stories is in the amazing attention to the particulars of the nuances of the people around them and the sensitivities and the humor and the beauty of the language. And so, of course, I think that, I think it just would have been different. Who knows? But it's a good question. Yeah. Oh.
In your opening line, you mentioned 100 low lead. Tells me you're a pilot. And do you have any harrowing experiences winging along in the air?
I don't really want to admit this story, but I will. So I learned to fly. I was flying into a little airstrip in northern Montana to go kayaking with my friend who just graduated from law school. That's what he wanted to do as a treat. So we went in. And I loved the river, the Middle Fork of the Flathead, but I loved the flight in just as much, and we were flying so close to the ridges, you could see the elk tracks stringing up through the snow. And I asked the pilot, he was kind of this cowboy with a handlebar mustache. He was real brash. And I said, could I learn to do this, like for a magazine article? I mean, how fast could I learn this? And he said, oh, you give me $5,000 and 3 weeks of your time and we'll get her done. Well, he got fired 2 weeks later for drinking on the job while he was flying. But that chief pilot up in Kalispell by Glacier National Park, this guy Dave Horner, is one of the great backcountry pilots alive. He has 30,000 hours tracking wolves and grizzly bears for wildlife biologists, radio collared, and you're always flying low and slow. I mean, the guy's truly amazing. When I first looked into his plane, this 185, he said, I can stack 7 wolves back there like cordwood. And what he meant was anesthetized wolves when they had to move a pack for the Wildlife Service. And he told me that once he had to move a problem bear from the same meadow where we landed, this huge boar grizzly bear that was tearing up cabins. And so they tranquilize the bear, but they tranquilize him with a drug that keeps him conscious. It just paralyzes the muscles. So he can lie there and think mean thoughts. And the bear was so big that it took up most of the airframe of the Cessna 185, but the head was right here on his hip. And he had his .44 Magnum in his lap. And he went downwind and he was up at the end of the runway doing his grass strip, doing his run up. And he looked down and he saw the lip go like, and he set the brake, he ran out, he opened the door, he started pulling on limbs and tugging and everything, and he got the bear halfway on the ground, and he got him out, and he landed on the ground, and the bear got up, all woozy, and looked at him, and he hopped in the plane and he took off. And he circled and he saw the bear going into the woods. And, I mean, can you imagine if that had happened 5 minutes later when they were 2,000 feet above the ground? So anyway, he was really, it was like learning tennis from Roger Federer. I mean, it was, it was amazing. And we'd come landing in Polson, on my 5th day or whatever, and he'd say, Heller, you drive a truck, don't you? And I'm like, yes, sir. He's like, you drive a motorcycle? Like, yes, sir. He's like, well, this isn't either one, goddammit, it's a bird. Light adjustments. Then we'd land, and he'd look at me and go, that was atrocious. And this guy had just graduated from high school. He was a big timber logger before he was a pilot. To haul out a word like atrocious and use it on me was very special. And so anyway, when I finished and I got my license in 20 days, and I wrote the story, and you can look it on the website under writings. It's called A Wing and a Prayer. And he's just this wonderful person. That was the best part of it. But a year later, he called me up and he said, hey, my buddy, he was a biologist at Missoula. He helped introduce the wolves to Yellowstone, to the Rocky Mountains. He's getting too old to fly his 182. I think you should buy it. It's pretty cheap. The engine's timed out, which means, it's it was at 1,490 hours, and 1,500 hours was timeout, which means, you've got to get an overhaul. But I just figured, knowing me, that I could just nurse it along for a couple of years, just change the oil a lot, and so I got it home, and then I took my wife up for the first flight. We went over to Paonia and flew back, and we were over the Continental Divide, and the engine started to go. And it started to redline. I couldn't pull it back. And it was, it was over revving, and I said to Kim, I said, we're going to try and make it to Erie. I think the engine's going. And she was amazing. I mean, this is when I knew I'd married the right woman. She turned to me and she said, good idea. And we made it. I mean, we had the altitude. It's, Erie's about 12 miles off the mountain front. We landed, and the oil pressure dropped to nothing. And the guys who overhauled the engine said they'd never seen an engine so torn up that wasn't in a live wreck. And we were very lucky. So in a way, it was helpful because now when I fly, I'm always looking for a place to land. I mean, they tell you to do that, but I really do it. I'm like, okay, I can land there, I can land there, that'll be tough, but we could do it, so, yeah. So
that bear story was in the Dog Stars, wasn't it?
Yeah. I put all these stories in wherever I encounter a great story like that, I try and cram it into the novel because it's so good. Yeah, I can hear you, I think, without a mic.
You're a tremendous raconteur, but you also...
Right. So when I wrote The Dog Stars, I told you I wrote it in this white heat, and I finished with a poem, and I basically just sent it in, and my agent sold it to Knopf in a week, and the editor, she trimmed 2 pages out of the book in aggregate, and they changed a little bit of the apocalyptic language, like capitalizing visitors instead of intruders or attackers. I had the visitors, all that kind of stuff. Changed that language. That was it. And I thought, wow, these editors in New York are awesome. They're so smart. They leave your stuff alone. How cool is that? So I thought, rewriting, who needs that, right? Then I started writing The Painter. And this is sort of cool. I started writing The Painter, and I started with the first line. A few pages in, I was like, this Jim Stegner guy sounds like Jim Wagner, my buddy, who's an expressionist painter in Taos. And but I made a command decision that it wasn't him because he was still alive, and the liability issues would have been too tough. So I just decided it wasn't him. Turns out, a few weeks later, I was like, I got to call him. I was like, I can tell that story later. But I began to think about it. Like, so my painter is fishing in a little dirt road. He's driving down the road to go fishing, and an outfitter is loading a horse, and the horse won't load. It's a little mare, and this guy starts to beat the horse to death. And our hero kills the guy and saves the horse, basically. It's a little bit more complicated, but that's basically it. So I started to think, well, should the guy have a brother? The victim, should he have a brother? Big, mean, tough outfitter brother. And I called my editor in New York, Jenny Jackson. I said, hey, Jenny, should he have a brother? And she said, yeah, of course. So I wrote the brother, and then I started thinking, well, should the brother be chasing him, bent on vengeance? And when should Jim go to Santa Fe to take the commission? Should the brother follow him? And then I began to think, I'm thinking about it. And that can't be good, because I didn't think about the first one at all, and it turned out pretty well. So I was going through this quandary, and I was in Paonia, Colorado, where we have a little place in it, and it's where the painter starts. And I was in the very coffee shop that my character meets his model, who becomes close with. And I was there, and it's a coffee shop as big as this rug up here. And there's a little table in the middle of it, and you're going to meet anyone who's in. This is a tiny little town, no stoplight or anything. And guess who was in there? Paolo Bacigalupi, the great science fiction writer. I mean, this guy has written, huge science fiction. He's won the Hugo Award, every award, big bestsellers. And we got to talking the way writers talk. He's from there, but I just didn't really know him very well. And I began talking about this struggle I was having, and he's much younger than me, but he picked up his coffee shop and he said, sit down, son. I want to tell you a story. And he said, I wrote one short story that was completely channeled, fugue state. I kind of woke up, sent it in, and it won a big award, and I love it. Second story, I engineered the whole thing. I plotted every second of the story before I wrote it. I designed the characters to interact a certain way in every scene. And I finished it, I sent it in, it won a big award, and I love it. And now when I look at them both, I can't tell the difference. I love them both. And he leaned forward and he said, your job is just to make sure it doesn't suck. And the creative burden just lifted off my shoulders. I was like, wow, I mean, that's something I think I can probably do, And it was one of the greatest things a writer has ever taught me. And what he was saying was, don't worry about how you get there, the method. Every story may have a different method, different levels of authorial control, different levels of revision. Write it. In revision, you can, tighten up the slow stuff, throw out the bad stuff, add stuff. Just make sure it's not terrible. And I have found that, and I just finished my 4th novel, 6 weeks ago, and I really love it. It's called The River. It'll be out next January, and it had a completely different way in. I mean, it started with a memory of something somebody told me, and I thought I want to write about this. That was sort of like an idea, which I'd never had before. Because I would always start with the first line. So anyway, I finished the Painter, and my agent made me rewrite it twice. And so I write fast, so that was like a couple of weeks. And then I sent it to my editor, and she made me rewrite it 3 times, so that was a couple more weeks. And then we had this marvelous conference call, which I will never forget. And I thought I was done, and I was with my agent, my editor, and me on this conference call, which you can do on your iPhone, which is so cool. And my editor said, we're 80% there. I was like, oh. She said, we need a prologue, we need an epilogue, and we need a scene 80% of the way through. Think of that. Wow. That functions in the same way that the control tower scene in the Dog Stars functions, which is a very violent, scary, cathartic scene. It's got to be, cathartic, white knuckle. Everything's got to come together. So I said, well, what would the prologue look like? And my agent said, Jason, this guy is stalking, has got to come back. I said, oh, it's got to be on the creek, right? She said, yes. And she said, he's got to be under Jason's control. Said, oh, he's got to have a gun. Yeah. And that was the epilogue. And I said, what did the prologue look like? And my agent said, well, it's got to be the scene where he shot the guy in the bar for making a comment about his son. And it was like such a no-brainer. And I came up with the 80% cathartic scene myself. And you'll see if you read the painter what that is. It's obvious. But it was so neat. It was like I had written this thing that I loved and that I thought was finished. But then it was like having 3 literary minds instead of 1 who steered me towards like the perfect revision that really helped a lot. So yeah, yep.
Let's go that side, then we'll go back over that side. And then in the middle.
Yeah.
Okay.
I fear my question may not bring about such fun stories to listen to, but obviously you have pitched a fly or two after trout. So I presume you know of the Adams fly?
I heard it was invented somewhere nearby.
Right here on the Boardman River.
That's awesome. It's a go-to fly. If you can't think of anything else, put a parachute Adams on and pray.
That's right. That's right.
It's awesome.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. We were going to go here. Let's.
I wonder about your interest in poetry, since that's.
There's a microphone.
Your interest in poetry, how it all began, and if you might be writing some poetry for us, and I just was introduced to a lovely poem called The Fish, and I wondered if, by Elizabeth Bishop, if you had heard of that poem before.
I love that poem. I love that poem. She catches the fish that's full, has all the old hooks in its mouth. It's, beautiful poem.
Yeah, it is, so.
Yeah, I still love poetry. The last poem I wrote was probably a year ago. I have 3 books of poetry in a drawer, ready to go. Huh. And I don't know, I should probably try and get them published. But it's still my first love. I have a few books on my bedside table, and 5 of them are poetry books. And I reread them again and again, the same ones, And so I have a huge interest in poetry. It was my first love. And so, yes.
Oh, over there.
Hi, Peter. Welcome to Michigan from Michigan Writers, back here in the back.
Oh, there you are.
Listening to your laugh is a joy. Wow.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering, with where you're at in your career right now, how do you define success as a writer?
That's the hardest question of the night. I don't know. I don't think there is such a thing. I think I can't think about that. For me, here's what I think. Somebody else told me maybe the most important thing that I ever heard from a writer, and it was just so wonderful. I'll share it with you. I was at the Iowa Writers Workshop, which I didn't go to until I was like 33. Because I was living in Colorado, I was making my living writing magazine stories. Why would I go to Iowa, right? Well, I went there, and it was beautiful. I loved it. And I loved being around 50 other people that thought poetry was the most important thing. And they lived and breathed poetry. It was magnificent. I also was studying poetry and fiction at the same time. So I was with the fiction writers who just wanted to tell a good story. They were so excited. And I was studying with Jory Graham, the great poet, contemporary poet. And I was in a seminar, and everybody in the room was wearing black except me, all black. And we were talking about the opacity of a poem. and how hard it was to get it, to understand and get into. And somehow the conversation led to, who you write for. And Joy said something amazing. She said, I think every poet comes to the poem with a question, and the poem is the answer. Why ask your question of a teacher or a critic or an audience or a market? Why not ask your question of God? Aim high. And I just thought that was like so profound. And so when I write, I just want to write something true and beautiful. That's all I know how to do. And I don't want to think about measures of success, because I won't ever, if there is one, I won't ever reach it. And maybe the success is just in the work every day, coming to work with a certain humility. I mean, I don't wait to get inspired or anything like that. The French, I was in France, they love this stuff because it's about the American West, and they're just crazy. They have no wild country in France. It's been lived in since the dawn of time. And the French love novels where things happen. They're like, oh, your novels, so many things happen. It's so exciting. It's like, but they have this sort of mythos about writers that they have to suffer and wait and get inspired and everything. And so when they were taking my portrait at Axud, which is sort of the Knopf of France, where they published, the photographer, I went and I leaned against a tree and I went, and like an American, and he said, oh no, I want you walk like this. I looked at him and I said, you got to be kidding me. No, I'm not doing that. But I realized, the French writers, they have to suffer and drink a lot and, have affairs and, and get inspired. And I really believe that you come to the work with a certain humbleness, and it's like making furniture. I put my apron on every day. I sharpen the chisels. I cut the wood, sand it, put the pieces together, try and make something that's solid and beautiful and for a day, and then put it aside.
We have a question right in the middle over here. Oh, in the balcony. Let's go to the balcony first, then to the middle.
Thank you. Peter, welcome to Traverse City. Please come back at least in the last week of April for opening day of trout season. We'd love to have you
Nice.
fish.
Yeah, wouldn't that be good?
Yeah, I was in Colorado. I was in Denver at a conference, and I always try to find the independent bookstore. So I was at the Tattered Cover, and I didn't so much find Dog Stars as it found me. It was it just really captured me. So it's a beautifully written book, and it has stayed with me ever since I picked up that first sentence. So thank you for that. Curious about beyond the poetry. So when you read fiction that captures you, that gives you joy, who are some of the writers and some of the books that you've read that have really stayed with you?
It's mostly the poetry that stayed with me. It's the music and the language. I sit down, I hear it the way some of us, hear Despacito. We can't help it. And I hear, the other day I was sitting down to write a new novel. I finished a novel 6 weeks ago. I was sitting down to start the new one because I really feel like, I really believe in momentum. It's like, don't sit around. And I was sort of listening for the first line, and you know who came to me? The music of the Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot. I kept thinking of the line, I was walking between three districts whence the smoke arose. One came walking. The rhythm of that. And he's talking about, he meets Jesus out in this industrial part of London, this character. And that happens to me. Yeats, I have walked and prayed for this young child an hour, and heard the sea wind scream upon the tower and under the arches of the bridge, and scream in the elms above the flooded stream. That music has stayed with me my whole life because I just love it so much. And so that's the main influence. But then there are certain novels I really, really admire. I really admire, the risks that Faulkner takes and the humor and the piling on of language. And I really admire the contemporary Japanese Japanese novelist Murakami, because he takes such risks in terms of, bending reality, and he does it so beautifully and so effortlessly. And I love certain, especially people writing in Spanish in recent years, like this Cesar Ira from Argentina, Mutis from Colombia, Villa Matas in Spain, who really bend conventions about storytelling and plot and don't care and are just having so much fun and are so smart and so lush and beautiful. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of influences, but I'd say the poetry the most.
We had a question in the middle, perhaps, right there. Yes. Microphone to your left.
I feel so lucky to have just read Celine
Yeah.
and to hear you talk about the book. Thank you. In the book, she says something about she has a parking angel. I have one too. My question is, did your mother have a parking angel?
She was unbelievable. I mean, it was really almost like freaky. I mean, it would almost be scary because she almost never had to go around the block. Someone would always pull out and she'd pull in. She was just built like that. It's pretty cool. I'm glad you have one. It's very special. You don't, yeah. You don't need to get, you don't need to be like an undercover cop and put that little thing in the windshield. Let's take two more, and then, yeah.
I've got one over here. Oh, over here?
Oh wait, she just started.
Oh,
When you're in your coffee shop writing,
Here,
are
use
you
mine.
using pen and paper, or are
can
you on
can you
a...
start over? Just
When you're in your coffee shop writing, are you using pen and paper or a computer?
I have a little laptop, but what I do is I put on headphones and I listen to, I have an app called Simply Rain, and it's rain, North Carolina rain on a tin roof, and you can adjust the intensity of the rain and the frequency of the thunder. And it's the most awesome thing because conversations about real estate just die out, and you're just in this bubble of rain, and it's lovely. That's what I do. And then I write 1,000 words a day, and I'll just say this quickly, but I learned Graham Greene wrote 500 words a day every day of his life, and he kept a subtotal. He'd stop at word 500 in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a love scene. And what I realized, he was stopping in the middle, and so that's what I do. I write 1,000 words every day, but I always go just past the time in the middle of a scene so that I'm not writing through a scene and stopping at a transition that's white space and coming back to white space every day. I stop in the middle of a scene. I can't wait to get up in the morning and keep going, and I keep momentum that way. Yeah. So let's take, one. Should we do two more?
two more.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Just it's wonderful to have you here. I read Painter first, and I've done a fair amount of reading. I had never read a book written like that in my entire life. The way, you said that was the second book, so you sat and talked to the guy, and he said, with some intent, write a certain way. Did you purposely choose to write that book like that? It was almost like, I kept thinking, where's the punctuation? Where's it? It was like you were talking to somebody. But I loved it. It made sense to me. It was like a conversation you were having in this guy's mind, explaining your concepts of his situation. Then I read Dog Star. I thought, Jesus, is this going to be the same way? It was completely different. So did you consciously choose to talk that book out as opposed to over punctuation? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, like I said, I just listen for the voice and then, go with that. And I feel like that because I grew up with my dad reading to me so much, I think I write to be read aloud, so that the punctuation would only be there to help someone who's reciting. Because when you hear a story aloud, you don't see the commas or the periods, so they're just cues to help someone who would be reading it aloud. That's how. And because those two novels are first person, somebody is telling the story in their own voice. I just wrote it as naturally as I could. Who cares about the Oxford comma or whatever? It's like So. Okay. Well, last question. Yeah.
The West is full of dinosaurs. Do you have any experience with any of them?
With dinosaurs?
Yeah.
No, but I have, in a way. I mean, I have one of my dear friends is a paleobotanist. And he took me on a dig once in the Escalante, and we were digging up 70 million-year-old leaves right before the asteroid hit. So it was the plant communities that existed before the mass extinction, 65 million years ago. And he was an aficionado of extinction. It was the neatest thing. You'd be sitting up on this sort of mudstone ridge on this little shelf that you'd picked out, a little shelf, and you're standing there and you're breaking rock. And he would say to me, he'd say, Pete, a big fossil doesn't come from a small rock. So you try and get a big rock, and then you find a hairline crack and you tap it with your rock hammer, and it splits at the leaf. And it opens up to a leaf that looks like it was laid down yesterday. 7 orders of venation. Can you imagine? You see the split, 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 split. And I would look at it and I would hand it to him and say, "Is this one interest you?" And he'd go, "Oh, that's a new species." Huh. And you'd put it back together, and you'd wrap it up in toilet paper, and you'd tape it, and he would label it, and he'd set it in this box like this precious egg. And we were driving back to Denver, and the museum, it's the Museum of Nature and Science in Denver. Now he's head of the Smithsonian, but he was working there then. And we were driving back, he said, we have the greatest collection of fossils, of plant fossils of the late Cretaceous on Earth, in the back of the truck. And I was like, this is cool. This is really cool. And later, I think my discussions with Kirk Johnson were the ones that it really informed the dog stars being post-apocalyptic and all, because we would meet for breakfast like once a month in our neighborhood. He lived in the neighborhood, coffee shop, and we'd have breakfast, and we'd always end up talking about the 6th great mass extinction, because he was a connoisseur of extinction. And we're in the middle of one right now, and it's caused by us, as I said. And I would get really, and they weren't depressing conversations. They were kind of exciting. We would always talk about what happens when this starts to impact human society, the way it's just starting to now, in a real dramatic way. And we kind of got all excited about it, but I would say, like, well, what about the swallows, and what about you and me and Kyle? It's Kyle's kitchen, right? And he'd go, "Don't be so high maintenance." Well, the Earth will be fine. Look, it shrugged off 95% of its biota before, and look at the biodiversity we have now. It'll be fine. He had the long view, which was so cool. But I think it was talking to him that really informed this post-apocalyptic story. So, thank you so much for coming tonight.